Hey friends, my name is Cian or Hylian Cream, and I'm a Janome maker. And today, for my project, I figured since we are in spooky month Halloween, I would give you guys a little run through and some sewing tips and tricks on how I made my Halloween costume. This costume is a design from a game called Project Diva and the song Clover Club. And I've been wanting to cosplay this version of her for years now, and I figured now would be the perfect time to do it. And I was able to do that with both of my Janome machines, my Airthread 2000D and my Skyline S9. So in today's video, you can expect some tips and tricks through all the process of building from the dress, the hood, the apron, and bows. But more importantly, I did put in 4 main points in this video to follow. It is going to be a reminder from my last Janome video on how to put elastic in to create gathers, how to properly install an invisible zipper, how to create inseam pockets, and the uses of a tube turner. Regardless, throughout this video, you are going to see a lot of different tips and tricks that I am able to achieve using both of my machines. So without further ado, let's get started.
Okay, so let's get started. So I'm going to start by opening my pattern up, marking off the pattern pieces I need, and cutting them out and laying them off to the side. Patterns used are Simplicity S9006 and McCall's R11300. From here, I'm going to go ahead and take my measurements, and I have my handy dandy Janome measuring tape. For this one, I specifically took my bust, waist, and hip measurements, along with my waist to hem measurements, and that'll come in handy in just a bit as we begin to cut the fabric. I'll use these measurements to take a look at the back of the pattern as seen here, so that way I can get the right size. And here's my beautiful fabric from my local sewing shop, my iced coffee, and let's get ready to go. So I begin by marking off all the pattern pieces so I know what fabric I'll be cutting since I have a few. I'll go ahead and flip the fabric inside out and begin pinning and cutting. As you can see here, I'm going to take that measurement, which ended up being 18 inches, and I'm going to alter the skirt just slightly so the hem comes up a little bit higher. I repeat this process on the back of the skirt as well, so that way that they match up once I begin sewing. I'm going to go ahead, move on to the top, pinning before I begin cutting them once again, and luckily for all the remaining patterns, there wasn't any modifications needed. So for today, I will be using the Tried and True Superior Threads Sew Complete Summer Collection. I ended up really liking this, and I use this project also as a test for it. Highly recommend. The quality is very nice, especially when sewing on your Janome machine. So I'll go ahead, thread my machine, put on my hem guide, and then the next thing that's super important is to mark all of your darts, transferring them from your pattern to your fabric. And I did this for both my fashion fabric layer as well as my lining. I'll go ahead and stitch those down on all of them. And then once we're there, I will be using my Oliso iron and a little pressing ham to go ahead and press all of the pieces down. It is super important you do this to get a nice, flat, and professional look. From here, I'll be sewing each piece together at the shoulder seams as well as the side seams. And I did this for both the fashion layer and the lining. And we'll go ahead and take one last final press on the side seams and the shoulder seams before I'll go ahead and pin both pieces together. This is your polite reminder to always press your seams, press your work. It'll make it look so much more professional. So once pinned together, I went in and basted around the bottom, top, and the armholes. And I did want to mention that the pens I'm using are friction pens as they iron off, so they're super nice to use, and especially here where I will be marking where my elastic guide will go. Next, I will be measuring my arm where I plan to have that elastic fall. That way I make sure it's just enough stretch and not too tight. Today I'll be using 1/2 inch elastic for this, and I'm going to go ahead and take that arm measurement and add on about 2 inches to the end of it before cutting it. I will cut 2 of these because we'll be making one for both sleeves. And from now, following that last Janome tutorial I made, if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it, is we're going to go ahead and along that line we marked, slowly stretch our elastic. And if you look at the back of the machine, you can see the fabric is already beginning to gather. In here you can see it's nice and stretchy, so once I put it on, I'll be nice and comfortable, but also it leaves a really cute little gather. From here, I'll be marking a 1/2 inch at the hem of my sleeves. I'm gonna go ahead and press this in, and I'm gonna do a simple rolled hem on this at the 1/2 inch mark. I went ahead and set my needle to the far left position before I began sewing along the left side of my presser foot to make sure I got a nice straight stitch. From here, I sewed the seams together on both sleeves, and I did serge that seam to have a nice clean finish. So the last step on these sleeves is I did 2 basted lines at the top half of the sleeve. And when you do basting, you're going to go ahead and clip those threads on the front, and I like to pull the threads on the back. This is going to create a gathering effect that is needed on these really cute puff sleeves. From here, you'll go ahead and pin it to your armhole, make sure everything fits before sewing it down, and then I like to finish mine with a serger so it's clean again. Now we're moving on to the hood. I have a fashion layer made of cotton. That's the same as my dress, as well as the lining and satin that's good for your hair. I went ahead, sewed around at a 1/2 inch, and now as you can see, we have this curve. Anytime you come across a curve on your projects, you're going to want to clip your corners. You'll notice that once you go in for a press, it's going to leave it nice and sits perfect. In the final step, I went in and pressed both the lining and fashion layer before sewing them together. And in the next step, I will go ahead and understitch the satin lining of the hood. The final step is to baste the bottom, and then that is ready to attach to our final piece, that being a cute little collar with some ruffled trim added to the edges. Here I am top stitching it before we're ready for the final step, which is adding the hood on. As you can see, the hood is a lot wider than the collar. And so what we're gonna do is do the 2 rows of basting, pulling that, and that way we get another gathered stitch. We'll go ahead and pin that to the collar once and make sure that it's nice and fits just along there perfectly. And then we'll stitch that down before also going in and finishing that with a serger for a nice clean finish to our seam. So next we're going to learn how to put in inseam pockets. So you're going to go ahead and cut out 4 pockets. And we're going to go ahead here, and I'm just serging all the side seams of my skirt as well as all 4 pockets. This way they're nice and finished, and I can just begin sewing without having to worry about finishing my seams. Here's the 4. I just cleaned them up, clipped any extra threads off. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our skirt and we're going to mark where our pockets are going to be placed. Now, I like to give at least a 1/2 inch at the top for where the bodice and the skirt will match. And so in this case, I'll be marking about 1.5 inches down from the top of the skirt where my pocket will start. Go ahead and do this on all 4 sides, front and back panel, before we're going to lay our pockets down, and then we're going to pin them in place. Now, while my fabric is black here, you are going to want to put your right sides down onto the fabric. Now we're just going to go in and sew at a 1/2 inch. Make sure to back stitch at the start and at the end of your stitch. And don't forget to remove your pins as you sew. As you can see here, this is how it looks from the front as well as from the back. And now we're ready to move on to the next step. So we are now going to push that pocket out to our right. We can remove our hem guide there, and we are going to top stitch on that corner. I like to align mine to the left side of my presser foot to make sure that it's nice and lined up and creates a straight stitch. And here we're going to go all the way down from top to bottom of the pocket and top stitch it down. You're going to go ahead and do this to all 4 pockets. And once we are done with that, we are ready to move on to placing the pockets together. And here it is from the front and the back. So now we're ready to attach the pockets to each other. So we're going to lay one side of our skirt down flat onto our table, and then we'll prepare our other skirt to lay right down on top of it, nice and flat. We will line up at the top seams and right at the pockets. Go ahead and pin and make sure everything lines up nice and right, because as long as everything is lined up and once it is stitched down and you're able to flip your skirt inside out, everything will line up. You're going to go ahead and want to do this to both sides, so that way all 4 pockets become 2 pocket bags. Now we're going to prepare to sew it. I put my seam guide back on so that we're sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And from here, we're going to get ready and make sure that we begin to pivot our fabric once we get to the corner spots here, so that way we have a nice and correct 90-degree angle. We're going to go ahead and continue sewing this at a 1/2 inch just around the pocket bag. As you can see, stitching this down creates the pocket bag. And this is what makes it so you can hold your phone, your makeup, candy, your money, and yeah, it holds all of that. These pockets I have are pretty big, so it is also recommended that even if your pattern has a pocket, make sure it's something that you can correctly fit your hand into. It's comfortable, it's not too small. There are lots of additional pocket patterns found online that you can use in case the one that you have is just a little bit too small. So we're going to go ahead, pivot one more time, and then we're just going to stitch that 1/2 inch all the way down to the hem of the dress. And we're going to do this to both sides, and then you will have a finished skirt. And here is our skirt all sewn up inside out. And once we turn it the correct side out, you have perfect inseam pockets, and they are hidden from view. And the final step is to hem the skirt. So for a quick hem like this one for my costume, I just went ahead and serged the bottom. I'm going to be using this super cute trim that I'm using throughout, and we're going to go ahead and top stitch that on to the hem of this skirt. So as you can see, I'm moving my needle all the way over to the right, and I'm going to use the right side of my presser foot against that right edge of the fabric to make as straight of a line as possible. And the final step of this part of the video will be installing an invisible zipper. So we're going to take that zipper and open it up, and we're going to want to press it out. You want to take your iron and your finger and essentially run it along and open up that edge of the zipper and press it nice and flat. And once you zip your zipper back up, you'll notice it almost looks like a little taco. It's flat, and that's how you know you did it correctly. So now we're going to go ahead, open that zipper back up, and we're going to place the sides of the zipper onto that serged edge. Make sure to line it up from the top and start to pin it from top to bottom. And we're just going to pin one side for now. I typically like to start on my left side of my fabric. Make sure to be using your zipper foot or invisible zipper foot for this, and keep your stitch to the far left, and if your machine has a specific zipper stitch, use that to keep it as close to the teeth as possible. Now I like to zip it up, make sure it looks nice and visible, and I'm going to go ahead and flip it inside out, and I'm going to use this to line up my zipper on the opposite side. I like to make sure first that it lines up at the center waist seam and at the top collar seam. From there, I'll pin in between before I go ahead and unzip it. And now I can go ahead and start stitching once again. Go ahead, zip your zipper back up, and see the perfection that is a beautiful invisible zipper. And this is the finished first part of my dress, so now we're going to be moving on to the apron. For the apron, this is the McCall pattern I'll be using, and I will be modifying it as I won't be making the ties as long or adding pockets. So I know for sure I mark which pattern I will be using, as well as marking off the different pieces I'll need before I go ahead and cut those out. Here is the really pretty white fabric I picked up from the store, as well as the same trim again to match. And I'll go ahead and cut that pattern out before adding interfacing to the appropriate pieces, including the straps and the waistband. So once all that's done, I went ahead and started sewing all the pieces down, and I also sewed the hem as well as the straps. So now we get a quick tutorial on tube turning. So this one here is a loop turner, and all you have to do is to stick it into your tube of fabric and let it pop out the other end, latch it onto that top part of the fabric, and then you just have to pull it back through. Your other option are tube turners. I picked these up from Joann's, and you'll just stick the purple tube in before shoving the rest of the fabric through with the wooden stick. Now that we're done with that, just make sure to press and they'll be nice and flat. Here I'm adding those straps into the top before I'll go ahead and stitch that closed. This was also all done at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure to clip any of your corners before we go back in and give it a nice press. Finally, I just top stitch for a little bit of added decoration. So now I'm going in on the skirt and adding in the 2 basting lines before gathering it up, and that way I can add it to the waistband of the skirt. Make sure to press everything nice and flat. I stitched in the ditch the rest of the waistband. The final details were done by hand sewing on some snaps for closures. And here's the final apron, and now we're ready to move on to the bows. So for the bows, I didn't have any patterns I followed. I basically freehanded all of the little rectangles and shapes that came with this. Interfacing was added to the backing of every single bow, from the 2 tiny bows on the apron, the collar bow, as well as the big bow on the back. We're going to go ahead, stitch these, and we're going to turn them all inside out before using like a wooden dowel to make sure all the corners are popped out and pressing them nice and flat. These were pretty much all hand sewn together before being put together and attached to the dress via snaps. And these ones were hand sewn on. Ta-da! Here is the final look at the dress, front and back. This was such a fun build, and I am so excited to wear it later this month for Halloween.
You so much for watching my video. I hope you're able to get some tips and tricks out of this that can go towards your next costume or garment that you are planning to make. And let me know if there was one in the video that you really liked and are planning to use on your next project. Besides that, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your October and happy Halloween. Happy trick-or-treating. Bye.